At 78, I thought I'd experienced every possible heartbreak life could throw at me. Losing my husband, battling cancer, watching my body betray me one creaky joint at a time. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I heard after driving 9 hours through a torrential rainstorm to surprise my daughter Laurel. Standing in her doorway, soaked to the bone with my homemade cake, I accidentally eavesdropped on a conversation that would change everything. They wanted me gone? Challenge accepted. Here's how I changed my will and rescinded every financial guarantee in the most satisfying way possible. But first, let me tell you about that drive. The silver-haired road warrior's epic journey. What exactly drives a 78-year-old woman with arthritis to pack her ancient Honda Civic and attempt a 9-hour drive through weather that would make a trucker think twice? Pure, maternal delusion, mixed with the kind of stubborn determination that comes from decades of putting everyone else first. I convinced myself this surprise visit would fix everything between my daughter Laurel and me. Looking back, the only thing more ridiculous than my plan was how thoroughly I prepared for it. My bathroom counter looked like a pharmacy explosion. I counted each bottle twice because forgetting medication at my age isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially fatal. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was more concerned about my pill schedule than driving through what the weather service called potentially life-threatening conditions. The cake sat in my passenger seat like a 3-layer monument to misplaced hope. Carrot cake with cream cheese frosting and 24 tiny marzipan carrots I'd spent 3 hours making because store-bought decorations weren't good enough for my baby girl's surprise party. I'd wrapped it in enough plastic to preserve it through nuclear winter and surrounded it with towels like I was transporting the crown jewels. That cake represented everything wrong with our relationship. Me trying desperately to buy love with elaborate gestures while she treated my efforts like obligations. My car groaned under the weight of birthday supplies. Balloons that kept hitting my rearview mirror, homemade cookies wrapped in foil, and a cooler packed with her childhood favorites. I'd even brought streamers because somehow I'd convinced myself we'd have an impromptu decorating session, like when she was 12. The trunk barely closed, which should have been my first clue that this entire operation was based on fantasy rather than reality. The storm started as light drizzle, but escalated into something torrential by hour 3. Rain pounded my windshield so hard the wipers couldn't keep up. My arthritic hands cramped around the steering wheel as I white-knuckled through hydroplaning that would have terrified a NASCAR driver. Every joint in my body screamed complaints about the hunched driving position. But I kept going because turning back felt like admitting defeat. Pride makes people do incredibly stupid things. And apparently age doesn't cure that particular character flaw. My GPS kept recalculating the route, while I cursed modern technology under my breath. The thing kept directing me through construction zones and traffic that added hours to an already marathon journey. The loneliness hit hardest during those middle hours when the storm was worst and other drivers had the good sense to pull over. I talked to myself constantly, practicing conversations that would never happen. Surprise, sweetheart. I thought we could spend your birthday together like old times. I rehearsed that line until it sounded natural instead of desperate. I imagined her face lighting up, imagined us baking together in her kitchen, imagined finally bridging the gap that had been widening for years. The fantasy conversations were so vivid, I almost convinced myself they were memories. My arthritis medication rattled in the cup holder like a maraca keeping time with my delusions. Every pothole sent shockwaves through joints that had already logged too many miles in life. My left knee swelled until I could barely work the clutch, but stopping meant acknowledging that maybe this whole trip was a mistake. I'd already invested too much time and pain to quit now, which is exactly the kind of sunk cost fallacy that leads to financial ruin and emotional bankruptcy. The radio weather updates grew increasingly dire, with advisories about heavy rain all the way into Connecticut and recommendations to avoid non-essential travel. Apparently, driving through hell to surprise your emotionally distant daughter qualified as non-essential, but I was too committed to the fantasy to listen to reason. I switched stations whenever they mentioned road closures, preferring old country songs about heartbreak to reality updates about my questionable decision-making. Hour 7 brought technical difficulties that would have been comedy gold if they weren't happening to me. The defrost stopped working properly, fogging my windows until I could barely see. My ancient windshield wipers developed a rhythmic squeak that matched my heartbeat. The heat stopped blowing on the driver's side, leaving me half frozen while the passenger side cake stayed perfectly climate controlled. I spent 10 minutes at a gas station trying to figure out why my hazard lights wouldn't turn off, attracting concerned looks from younger drivers who probably wondered if I should still have a license. My surprise face needed work. I discovered while practicing in the rearview mirror. After decades of disappointment, my natural expression had settled into something between resigned sadness and chronic indigestion. I tried for joyful excitement, but achieved something closer to constipated confusion. The gap between how I wanted to appear and how I actually looked perfectly summarized the gap between my expectations for this trip and reality. The final hour crawled by as I rehearsed my entrance speech and tried to ignore the voice in my head suggesting this might not go as planned. I'd driven through literal hell to get here. Surely that effort would count for something. The cake had survived. I'd survived. And we were about to have the kind of mother-daughter moment that would make up for years of growing distance. I pictured us laughing about my dramatic arrival, turning the storm story into family legend. Laurel's house appeared through the rain, like a beacon of hope, windows glowing warm and welcoming. I sat in the driveway for 5 minutes, gathering courage and checking my reflection one more time. My hair looked like I'd been electrocuted, my makeup had migrated south, and my clothes were wrinkled from hours of anxious driving. But I had cake, I had presence, and I had enough maternal optimism to power a small city. This was going to be perfect. I grabbed the precious cake and ran through the downpour toward her front door, already planning my grand entrance. The warmth from inside beckoned like a promise of reconciliation. What I was about to discover would make the 9-hour drive seem like the easy part, when eavesdropping becomes a masterclass in heartbreak. Standing in her doorway, I became an unwitting audience to the most devastating performance of my life. The front door had been unlocked, typical Laurel, so I'd let myself in planning my grand surprise entrance. I could hear voices from the kitchen, laughter bubbling over wine glasses, the kind of relaxed conversation that happens when people think they're alone. My first instinct was to call out, announce my arrival with theatrical flair, but something in their tone made me pause. I swear she calls every single day with some new medical drama. Laurel's voice carried perfectly through the open floor plan she'd bragged about during our last awkward phone call. Her tone held the kind of exasperated affection you'd use discussing a particularly needy pet. Yesterday, it was her blood pressure. Today, it's her arthritis acting up because of the weather. I can predict her conversations like a broken record. The cake box trembled under my arthritic wrists, whether from holding the weight or hearing my health concerns dismissed as attention-seeking manipulation, I couldn't tell. The buttercream frosting had taken me 3 attempts to get right, the decorative roses positioned with surgical precision. Now, it felt like I was holding evidence of my own pathetic desperation. At least she's consistent, Kent replied with the casual cruelty that comes from years of practice. Though honestly, sometimes I wonder if she'd be happier just getting it over with. She's been miserable since your dad died, and she makes sure everyone knows it. Maybe the universe is trying to tell her something. They both laughed at that observation, the kind of laughter that accompanies shared jokes about people who aren't present to defend themselves. The sound hit me like a physical slap, sharp and unexpected. Here I was standing in their entryway, while they discussed my potential demise over what smelled like expensive wine. God, can you imagine if she actually showed up here unannounced? Laurel continued, completely oblivious to the cosmic irony unfolding 10 feet away. She'd probably drive through a hurricane just to guilt-trip us about missing some random milestone. Then we'd be stuck pretending to be grateful while she rearranges our entire weekend around her schedule. The cake was getting heavier by the second, my joints screaming complaints that suddenly seemed less like legitimate medical concerns and more like the whining of an attention-seeking hypochondriac. I'd driven through weather that would terrify a meteorologist because I thought surprising my daughter would repair whatever had broken between us. Apparently, the only thing broken was my ability to read social cues. God, I hope she crashes. Laurel's voice carried a chilling casualness that made my blood freeze. Then we wouldn't have to deal with her constant calls. Kent's response came without missing a beat. Or at least get lost, give us a weekend without the guilt trips. Their laughter that followed hit me like a physical blow. My breathing had become embarrassingly loud, the kind of shocked gasps that happen when your worldview crumbles in real time. I pressed myself against the doorframe, hoping the sound of rain on their expensive windows would mask my presence. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, hiding in my own daughter's house like a burglar, eavesdropping on conversations about my own expendability. Remember when she offered to co-sign for the beach house? Laurel's voice took on the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing juicy gossip. I almost felt guilty taking her money, but then she started calling every day asking about paint colors and furniture, like she thought she'd be visiting constantly. Thank God we live far enough away that surprise visits aren't practical. The beach house comment landed like a physical blow. I'd co-signed that loan thinking I was helping my daughter achieve her dreams, imagining family gatherings and holiday memories being made in a place I'd helped provide. Instead, I'd apparently financed my own exclusion from their lives, paying for the privilege of being kept at a safe distance. My reflection in their hallway mirror showed exactly what they saw: a soggy old woman clutching a homemade cake like a security blanket, hair plastered to my skull, makeup smeared beyond recognition. I looked like the stereotype of the pathetic widow who couldn't accept that her usefulness had expired along with her husband. The woman in that mirror definitely seemed like someone whose disappearance would be more relief than tragedy. She means well, Laurel added with the kind of patronizing affection reserved for confused elderly relatives. But sometimes I think she forgets we have our own lives now. We can't spend every weekend managing her loneliness just because Dad had the courtesy to die first. The courtesy to die first. My Harold, who'd worked 60-hour weeks for 40 years to provide for this ungrateful child, had apparently done us all a favor by having his heart attack at 73 instead of lingering around to become an inconvenience. I wondered what they'd say about my own eventual death, probably something about perfect timing and inheritance management. The cake was becoming impossible to hold steady, my arms trembling from emotion and physical strain. Buttercream flowers were starting to slide sideways, creating an abstract art piece that perfectly matched my mental state. I'd spent 2 days creating this monument to maternal devotion, and it was literally falling apart in my hands while my daughter discussed the hypothetical benefits of my disappearance. My exit strategy formed itself without conscious thought. I couldn't confront them, couldn't pretend I hadn't heard what I'd heard, couldn't perform the grateful mother routine while their words echoed in my head. Instead, I backed toward the door with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, each step calculated to avoid the creaky floorboard I'd noticed during previous visits. The cake found its final resting place on their granite countertop, positioned perfectly between a bowl of decorative fruit and a stack of unopened mail. 3 layers of carrot perfection with a note that simply read, "Happy birthday, Laurel," in my careful cursive handwriting. Let them figure out how it got there. I drove home through the same storm that had nearly killed me getting there. But somehow the rain felt different now, less like punishment and more like preparation. Something had shifted during those devastating minutes in their doorway, something that would take me a while to fully understand. The woman who'd driven 9 hours through hell to surprise her daughter was gone. What was emerging in her place remained to be seen.